Hello and welcome back to our Wednesday ramble session, and today, or this week, we're gonna take it upon ourselves to make something interesting again, which schools and universities probably ruined it for you once upon a time, which is rhetoric. Immediately, you're probably thinking about half-naked guys in togas walking around giving speeches, trying to get into office or trying to get into the Senate. And of course, we have a lot of negative associations with this term called rhetoric, but this week's episode or this week's video, if it has one goal, that is to make rhetoric interesting again for you, is for you to understand these devices, is for you to actually spot them in your own writing or in some literature, and is for you to simply have fun investigating how language works. And hopefully by the end of today's video, you're going to regain some of that passion for language that has been long forgotten ever since your freshman English class. Now, the term rhetoric and the IRS tax code has one thing in common, which is that both of them stink of unnecessary complexity. Immediately, even a word rhetoric is probably like, oh my god, do I have to memorize all these weird ancient Greek terms, or do I have to understand all these Latin and Greek passages, or do I have to understand a completely different language just to understand a bit of rhetoric? But in fact, that's actually not at all true. So I graduated from a university, and there's my degree, with a major in French literature and a major in just good old literature. So I didn't have any classical training, but yet I did some deeper digging into my own personal reading journey and found some really interesting resources for studying rhetoric. So rhetoric doesn't have to be scary. If we think of it this way, rhetoric is essentially the special effects that you put on words, right? So for this video right here, I can, turn the screen blurry. For example, I can add on some crazy stickers. I can make a line of text pop up here. Think of rhetoric simply as the special effects on the screen that you can add to your words in speech or in writing, and it should be fun to do, and it should actually give your writing a more of a punchy quality if you use it correctly. And personally, I attribute a lot of my understanding of rhetoric to this tiny little book right here. It's only about 200 pages long. You can read it in a week. It's absolutely fantastic. It's funny to read, called The Elements of Eloquence by Mark Forsyth. And this book's essential argument is that if you want to learn about rhetoric, you don't have to bother with ancient Greek terms. You don't have to memorize all the things in this book. You don't have to memorize the weird names that I can't even pronounce half of these names, but all you need is to realize that you're probably already unconsciously using rhetorical figures of speech or writing, or you can probably recognize them in some of the media you consume. For example, one of the more striking examples from The Office is,
well, how the turntables...
It's probably been made into memes 1,000 times, but have you ever stopped to wonder why is it the case that there are probably like tens of thousands of lines from The Office, but why do we remember that one in particular? And actually, if we view this phrase right here, how the turntables, under the lens of rhetoric, we'll very quickly realize that it utilizes a figure of speech called the hyperbaton. Or you might find yourself saying this to your friend after he's on his way to the bathroom with a full bladder: run, Forrest, run. And yeah, you gotta wonder, out of all the lines from that movie, Forrest Gump, why is it the case that Run, Forrest, Run sticks out so much more than the rest of the movie? That's because Run, Forrest, Run is a diacope, a word sandwich where the first word is repeated at the start and the end of a phrase. Another example is Bond, James Bond, and actually in Wizard of Oz, there was a line called "Fly, my pretties, fly." But that line actually didn't exist in the movie. It's just because we're so used to perceiving speech and patterns in a certain way that sometimes our brains tend to make up these patterns of speech without us even realizing it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is all there is to rhetoric. They're just special effects on how you organize certain phrases and write certain words, and how you tend to organize your writing in a specific way to make your readers more engaged. And it's actually really funny how, there's not really a comprehensive book written on this, because we'd like to think of this writing thing as mystical, natural, inspirational. We think if we're having a good day, if we're caffeinated enough, we can simply shit out these lines of poetry. But there's a science to it, and today I want to walk you through some of my favorite rhetorical devices. And a quick note on these weird names of these rhetorical devices: it's completely unnecessary for you to memorize any of these weird names. I think you'll just learn them by heart over time, and they typically stand for things that you already know, so sometimes it helps to put a name to the thing. The best thing you can do for yourself is to practice this device in a sentence, or learn to recognize it in a TV show or from a speech. And also, if you want a practical guide on how to apply what we talk about in this video in your writing or in your speech writing or in your presentation, click the article in the link in the description, and it's going to take you to this page where I've written this long-ass article on how to practice rhetoric without falling asleep, essentially. So, without further ado, here's a list of some of my favorite rhetorical devices, and I can't guarantee that I'm going to get the pronunciation all right because some of these names, they get really obscure real quick. First one is Adenarton or Adenaton. I really don't know how to say half of these things because they're all based on Greek words. This is essentially a rhetorical device where you literally state the impossible, where you illustrate a case of impossibility. For example, you might as well try to hang out the ocean on a grapevine to dry to express certain kinds of impossibility. And this works really well if you want to say things that you don't really want to do. If someone forces you to go to a party, you can just say to them, if you really want me to go to that party, you might as well force me to eat the entire moon in one bite, because apparently it's made of cheese. Moving on to something a little bit less obscure, alliteration. Alliteration is simply a fancy way of saying you're grouping same letters next to each other to make them sound nice. And of course, Shakespeare was known to do this in many of his verses. For example, whereat, with blade, with bloody, blameful blade. Sometimes we just really love to hear the rhythm of words that are closely grouped together. And another one, which is from Charles Dickens, Old Marley was dead as a doornail. So you get the idea. Moving on to anatoplosis. And this is a device where you repeat the last word in a clause to begin the next. And yes, there's a prime example for this that did not come from high literature. It's from Star Wars. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hatred. Hatred leads to suffering. Suffering leads to the dark side. See how the last word in a given phrase or a clause starts the next one? And this is basically going to give a sentence an artificial kind of logical structure. And a lot of lawyers tend to do this. And you can probably see a lot of kind of like, destroyed YouTube videos in the debating sphere using this device a lot because they want to create that sequencing, right? The more sequencing there is, the more logical an argument sounds like, but it doesn't mean it's that logical. And moving on to anaphora. Anaphora sounds fancy, and it's a very powerful figure of rhetoric, but it's actually really, really easy to explain. You're essentially repeating the first phrase or the first clause every time you start a sentence. For example, if I'm explaining rhetoric to someone who doesn't exactly know what rhetoric is, I'll simply say, it's the barbecue sauce that makes those stale McDonald's chicken nuggets taste like a gift from the Lord above. It's the one-liner from a sitcom that drops you down on your knees with laughter. It's the glue that makes lyrics stick in your head. Notice that I started every one of those sentences with it's the, and it just keeps repeating itself. So if you really want to drill something really interesting into someone else's head, consider starting each sentence with the same phrase or the same clause. It's really going to add some weight to it. And of course, Martin Luther King, I have a dream. He begins everything with I have a dream, so it tends to stick around a little longer. And next, antithesis. Antithesis is basically a way of using opposites to illustrate a more pronounced quality. For example, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Or if you're talking shit about your boss behind his back, you can simply say, sure, he could keep it all up at work, but certainly not at night in bed with his wife. Look for oppositional qualities, good and evil, best and worst, and then put them in a sentence to create a contrast. What that's going to do is that it's going to really accentuate the quality of the statement that you're trying to make by showcasing its opposite. And next we have aposiopesis. Is that really how you say it? Correct my Greek pronunciation. I'm absolutely terrible at this. And essentially, this Greek word means becoming silent, and it's really easy to use. You know, sometimes a character just drops dead in a novel, and his voice or her voice or their voice is just replaced by 3 dots. That's essentially all there is to this rhetorical device. Moving on. And next we have congeries. Congeries is basically a device that has caused many hours of suffering for those reading the Iliad because, man, that Homer guy, he just decided to list out all the freaking ships in the book. And instead of just naming a bunch of ships in the Iliad, congeries is also great for creating a memorable end to a speech, you know, commonly found in Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Instead of just saying everybody, he said, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics. See how listing things out creates more of a memorable moment? That's essentially all there is to this device. Moving on to category D, we have a diacope, which is one of my favorite literary devices. Diacope is a verbal or rhetorical sandwich that basically repeats the first word of a phrase or a clause as the last word of the phrase or the clause, as in Bond, James Bond, or fly, my pretties fly, Or run, Forrest, run. Even though it's so simple to construct, this thing sticks in people's heads like nothing else. You don't believe me? To be or not to be. See? It always sticks in your head. And next in the C category, we have chiasmus. Chiasmus is a bit of a more complicated rhetorical device, but it's actually quite simple. It's a little bit hard to use, but once you use it, it's really going to create some really interesting effects. Take a look at this sentence. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. The second clause is essentially an inversion of the first one, and it creates a certain kind of symmetry. And you can construct a chiasmus by simply reversing the second clause to mirror the first clause. For example, talking shit about your boss again. He issues absurd orders because all the absurd orders came from his issues. And next, we have analogy. Makes me sound Italian when I say that. So analogy is a different way of saying deliberate grammatical mistakes that's going to make your phrase stand out a lot more. Take this sentence, for example. Let us go then, you and I. Even though it sounds poetic, but it's actually not grammatically correct. It's supposed to be you and me. Because when you get abducted, you're not going to say, let I go. Let I go. That simply doesn't make any sense. But somehow, you and I sounds a lot better than you and me. So certain times, if you really want a sentence to stand out, try your best not to overdo this, but sometimes deliberate grammatical mistakes could really make a sentence stand out. And the next device that I really like is hendiades. And this effect comes from changing an adjective into a noun. For example, if you want to say, I walked through the noisy city. If you use a hendiades, you can simply say, I walk through the noise and the city, or I love your beauty and eyes. So you're essentially turning that adjective into its own noun, and this is going to accentuate a more concrete quality to your descriptions, and you can play around with it. I love the satiation and the water. Doesn't sound that poetic, but you can use this device. I know you're a better writer than me. Anyway, moving on. Hyperbaton. This is a really interesting one because we mentioned it once before. When we try to describe anything, it usually follows this kind of weird order of size, age, shape, color, origin, material, purpose. Any sentence that kind of breaks that pattern sounds really weird, but sometimes Hyperbaton capitalizes on that weirdness to create a more poetic phrase. For example, from Richard Lovelace, stone walls do not a prison make. What the hell is the prison supposed to make? See, it makes no grammatical sense sometimes when you reverse that order, or, how to turntables, but you see how it just sounds a lot more funny or a lot more poetic in Lovelace's case? When in doubt, twist the order of words, and the results might just surprise you. Next one, we have hyperbole. You've probably learned about this in high school, and a lot of people say hyperbole, which is not correct, or who the hell knows how to say certain Greek words anyway. Hyperbole is essentially an exaggeration into the realm of the impossible. That's a ton of money that I've invested into S&P 500, and now it's not worth a single dime. See? Those are two cases of hyperboles because you don't really have a ton of money. At the same time, well, it's not worth a dime. And moving on, we have litetes. This device calls for affirming something through its opposite. For example, if you want to describe silence, you can say not a drum was heard, not a funeral note. And if you play around with a lot of these litetes, that just came out wrong. It could really branch into the territory of irony. Today's weather is fantastic. I can't see a single ray of sunlight. That's simply describing the lack of sunshine. Instead of saying it's a cloudy day, sometimes it's more fun to say there isn't a single ray of sunshine. And next on the list, we have an evil twin called metonymy and synecdoche. So metonymy is a very neat device of reducing things to their specific parts. For example, you're trying to describe a friend who's wearing a mustache, who's also wearing a bomber jacket with number 10 on it. With metonymy, you can say something like, that jacked up number 10's walking to the bar again. And in its most extreme form, which is called a synecdoche, you're literally reducing this person down to a specific body part. And if we were to describe this friend again, the mustache walked into the bar. And marching on with everything in the P category, polyptoton. Polyptoton breaks one of the golden rules that you've probably been taught in high school, which is you shouldn't use the same word twice in a sentence, which is blatantly not true when you get to a more advanced level of writing and reading. Sometimes you can use a word in different cases and different verbs and different tenses, and yeah, it makes the writing sound better. For example, from Richard II, from Shakespeare, Grace me no grace, nor uncle me no uncle. The first grace is used as a verb, while the second grace is used as a noun, and it's the same case with the uncle that followed. How about this? Even though everyone wants to practice the art of writing, the practice seems to be lost on everyone. So practice is used twice, but one of them is a verb in the first case, and a second one is a noun. So you can absolutely use the same word twice, just use them in the form of the polyptoton. And the next one, most of you are probably familiar with rhetorical questions. Then again, rhetorical questions, this is a whole can of worms, so let's do a quick firing round just on rhetorical questions. Eretesis, this is a rhetorical question where a normal clause is formed as a question to make it sound better. For example, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Epiplexis, these are basically insults and laments phrased as questions. What's wrong with you? Why would you do that? How dumb are you? Anakoinosis. This is a rhetorical question where you demand an audience to respond in a specific way. For example, what do we want? Climate action. When do we want it? Now. And then we have the hypophora, which is something that's immediately answered after you ask a question. Does this sound ridiculous to you? Absolutely. Blazing to the S category, we have the schisis onomaton. A lot of the times we think that in order to write a sentence, we have to have like a subject, a noun, and a main verb because the subject is doing something to the noun. But actually, sometimes that's completely unnecessary, especially for scene setting. For example, if I want to set the scene for this room, I can basically say light, shining, lamp in the background, books scattered across all surfaces of the room. I am sitting here recording a video. Moving on, solipsis. Solipsis is basically one verb applied to different nouns to create a cohesive or humorous effect. For example, Dorothy Parker allegedly said this: I barely room enough to lay my hat and a few friends. For example, the lay for the first word, laying down your hat, that's for the hat, and the second lay is actually applied to a few friends, although I don't know how you can lay your friend. I get it now, Dorothy. Next one, synesthesia, the impossible to pronounce word. Also, it's a really tricky condition. You know, I'm sure if you took psychology classes, you're pretty familiar with this word. Sometimes our senses could mix, right? And in writing or in a speech, we can also mix our senses. For example, the sound of a wet morning. What the fuck does a wet morning sound like? Or it smelled like victory. Does victory smell like deodorant? You can mix different senses to create these different effects, and if you do it right, it might just make your line more memorable. The next one nearing to the end here, transferred epithets. This is where an adjective is accidentally transferred to a different object. For example, the man smoked a nervous cigarette on his work break. There's no reason why a cigarette should be nervous. Or if you're into playing poker, I played a lucky hand. There's no reason why your hand should be lucky. This is just a rhetorical device to make it sound a little better, to make it sound a little more poetic. And have you realized, play a lucky hand? These phrases or these clauses, they tend to stick around. And speaking of sticking around, we have the tricolon. Tricolon is basically an isocolon, but in a group of three. For example, friends, Roman, countrymen. And for some reason, the human mind loves groups of threes so much, so when in doubt, group things in threes. And a funny story is that there was a speech given by Winston Churchill in 1940, and he actually said something like blood, toil, tears, and sweat, but all we can remember is blood, sweat, and tears, right? So that's the common expression attributed to Churchill, but he never said it. It's just so interesting that sometimes we can have this Mandela effect with words, where we expect words to sound a certain way because they conform to certain rhetorical figures, but in fact, you know, the original is completely different from the rhetorical device. Whew. We have made a complete mess of my deck of cards, but hopefully this was something fun for you guys. It's a longer video because I really got on a roll back there. But essentially, when in doubt, consult this video again to revitalize some of your understanding of rhetoric. And of course, watch this video from different points to get a deeper understanding. And of course, practice them in your writing, practice them in your presentations, and just to play around with them until you can start to spot them in TV shows, until you can write with them, and until you give an excellent speech with a chiasmus in it, you're basically on the right track to understanding rhetoric. Anyway, thank you for allowing me to indulge in this nerdy interest of mine to cover all these rhetorical devices. Then again, I haven't covered all of them. You can read Mark Forsyth's Elements of Eloquence. Nevertheless, that's all I have. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next Wednesday for another video. Robin Waldun here. Hope you're having a great day so far, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, and goodbye.